70 tons of fear. A German deadly weapon that all allies feared. The history of the Jagdtiger. Imagine a machine that weighs more than 70 tons and yet is capable of destroying any enemy tank at a distance of almost 4 kilometers with a single shot. A machine whose frontal armor could not be penetrated by any Allied anti-tank gun, even at point-blank range. A machine at the sight of which American and British tankers turned around and retreated because they realized they did not have a single chance to survive in a direct encounter. This machine existed, and its name was the Jagdtiger. The heaviest mass-produced armored vehicle of World War II, it became the embodiment of German engineering and, at the same time, a symbol of the despair of the dying Reich. After the crushing defeat at the Kursk Bulge in the summer of 1943, many Germans, even those blinded by Goebbels' propaganda, began to realize the terrible reality of the impending collapse. The forces of the anti-Hitler coalition outnumbered Germany's forces many times over, and this gap only increased with each passing month. Soviet factories in the Urals were stamping out thousands of tanks. American conveyor belts worked around the clock, and British shipyards launched new ships. Only a miracle could save the dying German state. It was then that talk began in Germany about a wonder weapon that was supposedly capable of turning the tide of the entire war. The leadership of the Reich grabbed at any significant military technical projects which, with their originality and terrifying power, could perform not only combat, but also psychological functions, instilling thoughts in the people about the strength of a state capable of creating such complex equipment. It was in this atmosphere of despair and hope for technical superiority that the project for a super-heavy self-propelled artillery unit was born, which was to become the absolute tank destroyer. German designers followed a tradition formed in the early years of the war, which consisted of using the chassis of mass-produced tanks to create self-propelled guns on their basis by installing more powerful weapons. When the Tiger II heavy tank entered service, engineers immediately saw it as an excellent base for a super-powerful machine. If the tank itself was armed with an 88mm long-barreled gun, then logic dictated that the self-propelled gun should be equipped with an even more formidable weapon of 128mm caliber, developed on the basis of an anti-aircraft gun. On October 20th, 1943, a wooden model of the future machine was presented to Hitler at a training ground in East Prussia. The Führer was impressed by the scale and power of the project, and on the same day gave orders for the start of mass production the following year. The new self-propelled gun received the official designation, 128mm heavy assault gun, but in the troops, it was known by the short and formidable name Jagdtiger, which translated meant hunting tiger. The design of the machine struck the imagination of even seasoned German tankers. The combat weight reached 70 tons, making the Jagdtiger the heaviest mass-produced armored vehicle in the entire history of World War II. The frontal plate of the casemate had a thickness of 250 millimeters and was positioned at an angle of 15 degrees, making it absolutely impenetrable to any Allied anti-tank weapons from a distance of more than 400 meters. The frontal armor of the hull reached 150 millimeters, and the sides were protected by 80mm plates. The heart of the Jagdtiger was its monstrous gun, created on the basis of an anti-aircraft weapon. An armor-piercing shell from this gun at a distance of 2 kilometers penetrated more than 200 millimeters of armor, which allowed for the destruction of any Allied tank at extreme distances inaccessible to the enemy's return fire. The high-explosive fragmentation shell possessed a colossal destructive effect and could hit targets at a range of up to 12.5 kilometers. However, behind all this impressive firepower lay serious technical problems that haunted the Jagdtiger throughout its short combat career. Due to cramped conditions inside the fighting compartment, designers had to abandon the use of unitary ammunition used in the ancestral anti-aircraft gun. Bulky, one-piece shells simply could not be turned around in the cramped casemate of the self-propelled gun, so the ammunition was made separate loading, consisting of a projectile and a casing with a powder charge. This decision required including 2 loaders in the crew at once instead of 1, as on most other machines. The loading process looked as follows. While one loader sent a heavy shell into the breech of the gun, the second was already feeding the casing with the charge. Despite the coordinated work of 2 people, the rate of fire of the gun remained extremely low and amounted to only 2 to 3 shots per minute. The machine's ammunition supply numbered 40 rounds, which were located on the floor of the fighting compartment and on the walls of the casemate. The full crew of the Jagdtiger consisted of 6 people: a driver mechanic, a radio operator gunner, a commander, and 2 loaders. The control compartment was located in the front part of the machine, where the main clutch, the steering mechanism, and the gearbox were located. To the left of the transmission were the instrument panel and the driver's seat, and to the right, a 7.92mm caliber Hull machine gun and the seat of the radio operator gunner, who was also responsible for the operation of the radio station, were installed. In the upper part of the frontal hull plate, designers made a special cutout that provided the driver mechanic with an improved view from the machine. And in the front part of the roof were entry hatches for him and the radio operator gunner. The fighting compartment occupied the middle part of the self-propelled gun and was an armored casemate with a gun. To the left of the gun were the aiming mechanisms, a periscopic sight with 10 times magnification, and the gunner's seat. The commander was located to the right of the gun, and above his place, a rotating cupola with a viewing device covered by an armored bracket was installed. With the help of the sight, the gunner could hit targets at a distance of up to 4 kilometers, which gave the Jagdtiger a colossal advantage in long-range combat. The vertical aiming angles of the gun ranged from -7 to +15 degrees, and horizontally, the gun could deflect 10 degrees in each direction. To hit targets outside this sector, it was necessary to turn the entire machine, which, given its enormous mass, was not an easy task. In the rear plate of the casemate, there was a special hatch through which ammunition loading, gun dismantling, and crew evacuation in emergency situations were carried out. In the engine compartment located at the rear of the hull was a 12-cylinder carburetor engine that developed a maximum power of 700 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. However, in practice, it produced only about 650 horsepower at 2,600 revolutions because the engine was already working at the limit of its capabilities. This same motor was installed on the King Tiger tank. But if its power was barely enough for the tank, it proved to be frankly weak for the even heavier self-propelled gun. The machine's chassis was catastrophically overloaded, leading to low mobility and constant breakdowns. Torsion bars, rollers, tracks, all this wore out at an incredible speed, unable to withstand the monstrous weight. German engineers perfectly understood that the machine's reliability left much to be desired, and therefore provided 2 stationary demolition charges in the design. One was located under the breech of the gun, the second under the engine. These charges were intended to destroy the machine in case evacuation was impossible, so that the latest technology would not fall to the enemy. In addition to the main armament, the Jagdtiger was equipped with a Hull machine gun with an ammunition supply of 1,500 rounds. A 92mm anti-personnel grenade launcher was installed on the roof of the casemate for fighting enemy infantry at close ranges. And on late production machines, a special bracket for an anti-aircraft machine gun was mounted, which could be used to repel air attacks. Mass production of Jagdtigers began in the summer of 1944. However, production rates turned out to be depressingly low. Over the entire period from July 44 to April 45, the German industry was only able to assemble about 80 machines. There could be no talk of any mass use of these super-heavy self-propelled guns, and most often Jagdtigers entered battle alone or in platoons, forming part of hastily formed battle groups. Initially, back in March 44, the German command planned to send the first 14 production machines to the 3rd Company of the 130th Tank Destroyer Training Battalion. However, since the piece-by-piece production of super-heavy self-propelled guns only began at the end of the summer, this company went to the front, equipped with completely different machines. Subsequently, all produced Jagdtigers went to 2 specially created heavy tank destroyer battalions, the 512 and the 653. According to the table of organization, each heavy tank destroyer battalion was supposed to represent a very formidable force. It included 3 line companies of 14 Jagdtigers each, as well as a battalion command staff group, which was entitled to 3 more machines. Thus, a fully equipped battalion numbered 45 super-heavy self-propelled guns. In addition, each unit was allocated 5 recovery vehicles based on the Panther, 14 half-track armored personnel carriers, and almost 150 vehicles of various purposes. Since the main threat to heavy equipment on the Western Front was enemy aviation, it was planned to attach 8 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns to each battalion to repel air attacks. 4 of them were armed with 37mm automatic guns, and 4 more carried twin 20mm anti-aircraft guns. On paper, everything looked quite solid and impressive, but the reality turned out to be completely different. In conditions of a total shortage of equipment, fuel, ammunition, and personnel, the battalions did not receive even half of the logistical base due to them by staff. Instead of 3 full companies, commanders had to make do with 2 of incomplete strength, and the promised anti-aircraft guns and recovery vehicles arrived in tiny quantities. The German military machine by that time was already bursting at the seams, and even priority projects like the Jagdtiger suffered from the universal deficit. The 512 Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion was formed in the city of Paderborn on the basis of a replacement battalion with the involvement of crews and staff officers from the 424th and 511th Heavy Tank Battalions. The machines and crews underwent combat training at a training ground near Döllersheim, where tankers mastered the peculiarities of controlling 70-ton giants and learned to use their strengths in battle. Hauptmann Scherf was appointed battalion commander, an experienced officer who understood both the capabilities and the limitations of the equipment entrusted to him. Instead of the 3 companies required by staff, he had only 2 at his disposal, and even those were not at full strength. The 1st company was commanded by Oberleutnant Ernst, and at the head of the 2nd stood a man whose name thundered across the entire Eastern Front, Oberleutnant Otto Carius, a tank ace and Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves recipient, on whose personal account more than 150 destroyed enemy tanks were listed. Carius by that time was already a living legend of the German tank forces. He earned his fame in battles on the Eastern Front, where he fought against Soviet tankers and Tigers. Now he was to test the latest super-heavy equipment in action. And many in the battalion hoped that under the command of such an ace, the 2nd Company would achieve outstanding results. However, Carius himself was quite skeptical of Jagdtigers, realizing that the clumsy and unreliable machine had little in common with the maneuverable tank combat in which he was used to winning his victories. On February 11, 1945, the 512 Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion received orders to move to the Western Front. The very first kilometers of the march turned into a real nightmare for the crews and technical services. Numerous breakdowns of engines and chassis haunted the column literally from the very beginning of the movement. Torsion bars could not withstand the monstrous load, track links burst, and overheating motors required constant stops for cooling. But mechanical malfunctions were only part of the problems. The sky over Germany in those days belonged undividedly to Allied aviation, and American fighter bombers hunted for any German equipment that dared to move during daylight hours. During the march to the front line, Allied aviation destroyed 2 Jagdtigers with precision bombing, turning 70-ton machines into piles of twisted metal. The crews died without even having time to enter their first battle. Due to constant breakdowns and air attacks, the column stretched for tens of kilometers, and the movement schedule was hopelessly disrupted. Only 6 machines of the first company reached the concentration area near the city of Remagen on time and in relatively good condition. The rest were either stuck on the route waiting for repairs or were abandoned by crews after it proved impossible to evacuate them. The demolition charges, prudently installed by the designers, did their job properly, and the Germans themselves destroyed precious machines one after another. The baptism of fire for the second company took place on March 8, 1945, near the city of Siegen, and on March 10th, the first company entered the battle in the Remagen area. It was there that fierce battles unfolded for the famous Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine, the only crossing that the Americans managed to capture intact. The German command threw all available forces into the battle to destroy the bridge, or at least stop the crossing of enemy troops to the east bank of the river. Hauptmann Scherf personally led his machines into battle for the Ludendorff Bridge, and it was then that Jagdtigers first demonstrated what they were capable of with proper tactical use. Choosing a successful position on an eminence, turning the machines with frontal armor to the enemy, and covering the lower part of the hull with an earthen embankment, the battalion commander turned his self-propelled guns into invulnerable firing points. American tankers in their Shermans simply could not get close enough for their 76mm guns to somehow threaten the 250mm frontal armor of the German machines. Scherf personally destroyed several American tanks in those battles, shooting them from distances at which the enemy could not even hope for effective return fire. 128mm shells pierced the armor of Shermans right through, and the crews of American machines often died before they even had time to understand where the shooting was coming from. The excellent armor performance of the Jagdtiger, especially in the frontal projection, became an insoluble problem for Anglo-American anti-tank weapons. However, it was still possible to hit the German super-heavy self-propelled gun. For this, it was necessary to get to it from the side or come from the rear, where the armor was significantly thinner. It was in this way that the Americans managed to knock out one Jagdtiger during the battles for Remagen. An enemy shell hit the side of the machine, whose crew was too engrossed in shooting at frontal targets and did not notice the threat from the flank. This was an important lesson for German tankers, who realized that even the thickest armor would not save them if they allowed the enemy to come from the side. In the second half of March, the main forces of the German army group found themselves in the so-called Ruhr pocket, surrounded by superior Allied forces. Both companies of the 512 Battalion fought fierce battles, trying to hold back the onslaught of American troops and give the surrounded units a chance to break out of the trap. From the end of March, the 1st and 3rd batteries of the division provided fire support to the 507th Separate Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped with King Tigers and Jagd Panther self-propelled guns. On April 11th, 4 assault guns and 3 medium tanks were additionally included in the 1st Company. This unit was named the Ernst Battle Group and was sent to defend the strategically important Bismarck Height, located on the banks of the Ruhr River. It was there that Jagdtigers showed their best combat qualities, acting together with assault guns and destroying American armored vehicles at extreme distances. In that battle, the combined German forces destroyed 11 American tanks, as well as about 50 armored personnel carriers and trucks. Several Shermans were hit by the 128mm shells of Jagdtigers from a distance of 4 kilometers, a distance at which American tankers could not even properly see their opponents. The Allies only managed to destroy 1 German machine, and not by tank fire, but by a rocket fired from a Mustang fighter. Air superiority remained the Americans' main trump card against the German self-propelled guns that were invulnerable on the ground. On April 9th, German troops, supported by heavy tanks and Jagdtigers, repelled a massive attack by American infantry, reinforced by 30 tanks. Before the start of the battle, the Allies carried out a powerful artillery preparation, and detected German positions were hit by fighter bombers constantly hovering over the battlefield. The attack was successfully repelled, but 4 King Tigers and 1 Jagdtiger burned under airstrikes. 2 more heavy machines received serious damage and were evacuated with the help of repair tractors. The next day, the surviving German machines began a retreat toward Göttingen. A platoon of 2 Jagdtigers from the 3rd Battery under the command of Feldwebels Arnold and Becker took a position north of a settlement when a large column of American troops appeared on the road. The Germans immediately unleashed a hail of fire on it. Jagdtigers fired at distant targets, while assault guns and tanks hit close ones. As a result of a short battle, the Americans lost 11 tanks and up to 50 armored personnel carriers and trucks. On the same day, April 11th, the 2nd Company under the command of Carius distinguished itself in the area of the city of Una, where the crews destroyed 15 American tanks. A number of Western sources attribute all these victories to Carius personally, although in reality, success was achieved by the joint efforts of several crews. In total, the 2nd Company in the battles in the Ruhr area destroyed and knocked out about 40 American tanks, inflicting very significant losses on the enemy. In addition to Carius and Ernst, the crew of Oberleutnant Randolph distinguished itself in the April battles, destroying 5 Shermans in 2 days. These local successes instilled hope in the hearts of German tankers. However, the general picture was bleak. Every destroyed American tank was replaced by 2 new ones, and every lost Jagdtiger became an irreplaceable loss. By mid-April, the position of German units in the Ruhr pocket became hopeless, and it was clear to everyone that catastrophe was inevitable. Realizing the desperation of the situation, Carius made a decision that was not easy for him. On April 15, 1945, he and the remnants of the personnel of the 2nd Company surrendered to the Americans in the area of the settlement of Iserlohn. Before the capitulation, the crews activated demolition charges, destroying several functioning Jagdtigers so that the latest technology would not fall to the enemy. For the famous tank ace, on whose account more than 150 destroyed tanks were listed, this was an inglorious end to his combat path, but there was simply no other way out. The next day, April 16th, Oberleutnant Ernst and the remnants of his battle group, in which 6 relatively intact machines still remained, surrendered to the command of the 394th American Infantry Regiment near the town of Iserlohn. The Americans looked at the captured super-heavy self-propelled guns with amazement, marveling at the thickness of their armor and the caliber of their guns. For most Allied soldiers, this was the first opportunity to see up close the legendary German monsters about which there were so many rumors. However, the history of Jagdtigers did not end there. The final point in their short and intense combat career was put 3 weeks later, and on a completely different theater of operations. According to fragmentary information collected by military historians, about 9 Jagdtigers operated within the 6th Panzer Army in April 45, which a number of sources identify as the 3rd Company of the 512 Division. The 6th Panzer Army provided fierce resistance to Soviet troops in the territory of eastern Austria until May 7, 1945. Here, far from the Western Front, German super-heavy self-propelled guns first encountered Soviet armored vehicles, and this battle became one of the last in the history of World War II. Soviet tankers, who had traveled 1,000 kilometers from Stalingrad to Vienna, met machines that in their firepower and armor surpassed everything they had had to fight before. On May 7th, the remnants of the 1st Panzer Division made a desperate breakout attempt through the demarcation line along the Enns River near the town of Steyr. The Germans intended to break through to the zone controlled by American troops to surrender to them rather than to the Red Army. Among the units breaking out to the west were 2, and according to other sources, 3 Jagdtigers, whose crews realized that this was their last battle. During an encounter, the German super-heavy self-propelled guns engaged in battle with Soviet tanks and, according to reports, managed to knock out 3 IS-2 tanks and 2 T-34-85 tanks. Soviet machines, despite their powerful armament, could not penetrate the frontal armor of Jagdtigers, and German gunners managed to realize the advantage of their guns in this short battle. This was the last victory of super-heavy self-propelled guns, won literally in the final hours of the war. However, Soviet artillerymen did not remain in debt. Soviet artillery fire damaged the chassis of one of the Jagdtigers right on a street in the town. The immobilized machine could not continue moving, and the crew had to abandon it before they could activate the demolition charges. It was this self-propelled gun, captured by Soviet troops as a trophy, that was later sent to the Soviet Union for study, and is today an exhibit at the Tank Museum in Kubinka, near Moscow. The crews of the remaining machines, realizing that further resistance was senseless, drained the fuel from the tanks and blew up their Jagdtigers. After that, the tankers reached the American occupation zone on foot, where they surrendered. For them, the war was over, and with it ended the history of the heaviest mass-produced armored vehicle of World War II. In less than a year of combat use, Jagdtigers managed to cause quite a stir on both fronts. These machines were created as a purely defensive weapon, capable of stopping enemy tank armadas at long range. In the hands of experienced crews who took a favorable position, they indeed became practically invulnerable fortresses, shooting enemy tanks from extreme distances. The 128mm gun knew no equal, and the frontal armor with a thickness of 1/4 of a meter turned any duel into an execution. But war is not only about duels in favorable positions. The terrible reliability of the chassis and engine, low mobility, constant lack of fuel and spare parts, and most importantly, the absolute superiority of Allied aviation, neutralized all the technical advantages of these giants. Most of the approximately 80 produced machines were destroyed by their own crews when evacuation was impossible or perished under bombs and rockets from the air. Only a few were lost directly in tank battles. The Jagdtiger became a symbol of the desperate attempts of the dying Reich to turn the tide of the war with the help of technical superiority. German engineers created a machine that was ahead of its time in firepower and protection, but completely unsuited to the real conditions of the war, which Germany was already hopelessly losing. The wonder weapon did not save the Third Reich, just as it was not saved by jet fighters, ballistic missiles, or other technical innovations that appeared too late and in too few numbers. If you liked this story about the heaviest combat machine of World War II, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Write in the comments what other legendary equipment you would like to know about, and we will definitely tell its story.